Chapter 7. The Ability to Change. Dalton reminded himself of something Einstein had famously said. The measure of intelligence is the ability to change. It was time to see how smart the staff at the Double Deuce really were. He'd made some initial adjustments to the way the club would run on his first night in charge. Nothing too dramatic. The cage was still up around the band, and the bouncers were still marked out mostly by their lack of sleeves. But he had planted the seeds of what he hoped would grow into meaningful improvements. Too much at once was just as bad as too little. People always needed time to adjust to a new regime, and installing a new regime often brings resistance at first. For one thing, he now had one of the bouncers properly manning the main door, checking out the customers as they entered and checking IDs when needed. He was using Jack for the job since he was the biggest of the bunch, and sometimes a show of force was enough to turn away problems before they developed. Dalton watched from his place at the bar, a good central location to monitor everything going on in the club. It was the same spot he'd claimed when he'd first arrived. Watching Jack at the door now, he saw that he might need to reconsider his choice. It was good to have a bear, but not one that was too easily tamed. Two girls, too young to be 21, walked in and handed over some IDs. Jack took a quick look, both at them and whatever plastic they'd proffered, and then said something while laughing. First mistake. Being nice on the door didn't mean being everyone's friend. Be too nice, and they were just as likely not to take you seriously, and that would lead to bigger problems down the line. What he should have done was calmly and firmly ask them to leave, in a way that brooked no hope of negotiation. Perhaps he would have done, given enough time, but then Steve appeared, patted him on the arm while saying something through a cheesy smile, and then walked the girls in. Second mistake. Dalton knew that he had specifically told Jack that he was in charge of the door, nobody else, and that anyone who was in the club that shouldn't be fell on him. He added this to the list of things he'd have to fix before the end of the night. He was sure that it wouldn't be the last. When he checked his coffee cup, he found it empty, and stared for a second at the last dregs of dark liquid that remained. One of the bartenders, Carl, saw the gesture and asked, "Leaded or unleaded?" Dalton knew he had a long night in store. "Leaded," he replied. He watched over Carl's shoulder while he filled the cup with the hot black mix, his eyes on the other, rat-looking bartender, Pat. He'd just made a sale and was walking over to open the old cash register, note in hand. He slammed down the button to make the sale and caught the tray as it slid out with a ding, but then shoved the note quickly into the front pocket of his jeans, before closing the register and heading back to the bar. Another problem for tonight's list. Then came that distinctive smashing of glass again, the first of the night. From his vantage point, Dalton quickly found the source of the problem. A drunk woman was clambering up onto a table, urged on by some even more drunk male friends. Dalton had told the bouncers that when something like this happened, their first move was to look to him. He was a little annoyed to find that they'd mostly slipped into their old habits and were not moving at all, as if everything was fine and dandy. Nobody was bleeding after all. Yet. He had to click his fingers and call to Hank twice to get his attention. When the young bouncer looked his way, he nodded to the developing situation. Hank looked back with an almost confused look on his face, like he didn't see the problem. "Yes, I want you to do your job," thought Dalton, then nodded more firmly. Hank headed over, addressing the most animated of the men at the table, a Hawaiian shirt-clad loudmouth who was clearly enjoying the woman's gyrations. "Hey pal," he said, "do me a favour and get her down off there, what do you say?" The man shrugged him off. "I say let her dance." Next, Hank reached up towards the woman, probably thinking that he may have more luck appealing to her. As he did so, the man shoved him away hard with a double-handed push to the chest. Hank stumbled a few feet, but managed to keep his balance. He restrained his first urge to respond with punches, which Dalton appreciated, then looked over at the cooler for advice about what to do next. Dalton nodded to him. Try again. This time, Hank tried a firmer approach, placing his hand on the man's shoulder and telling him, "Look, pal, we don't want—" But before he could finish, he was met with a punch to the face. Dalton could see that this was about to seriously escalate. As he left his position at the bar, he saw that his instinct was right. Rather than throw more punches, the aggressive drunk pulled a knife from somewhere, flicking it open and gesturing wildly at Hank. "Come on, motherfucker!" he shouted, while Hank kept his distance and pushed back some of the other nearby customers, putting himself between them and the knifeman. Come on, motherfucker!" He tried again, tilting the blade around with one hand and beckoning Hank on with the other. When Hank stood his ground, the drunk tried for a quick stab, then a slash, missing with both. As he raised the knife up high to his shoulder, Dalton stepped in and grabbed his wrist. In one smooth motion, Dalton stepped to the man's side, secured both of his hands on the wrist with the blade, and locked the man's elbow to 90 degrees. He knew that at this point, wherever the wrist went, the body would follow, so he swiftly racked the man's arm behind him, smacking it off a table to send the knife clattering to the floor. The man's head flew backward too, as Dalton had predicted. He also knew that when you sent a person one way, they instantly tried to fight it and come back the other, if they could. He grabbed the man's head by the hair on its return journey and used the momentum to keep it going, busting his nose off the table in front of him. Other bouncers quickly arrived, but by this point, the fight was over. Dalton still held the man securely. "Escort this gentleman to the door," he told them, as calmly as if he just spotted a sleeping drunk in the corner. Hank and one of the others took the man by the arms and dragged him away, with Hank saying, "Did you see that shit?" as they went. Frank had come out of his office when he heard the commotion below. He didn't usually, but Dalton had told him that he needed to change as much as everyone else, so he was doing his part. He caught the tail end of the altercation, watching from the bar as Dalton reached up to offer a gentlemanly hand to the woman who had been dancing on the table. She took it and allowed him to support her down safely. Then she too headed for the door. "He's good," Frank said to the bartender with a satisfied smile. "He's real good." On the stage, Cody wrapped up his rendition of Travelin' Band to a round of applause, then decided to give the onlookers the answer to the question he knew they were all asking. He spoke into the mic. "The name is Dalton." Dalton set about ticking off the first problem on his fix it tonight list. He looked around the club to find that all his bouncers were in place. All but one. He walked over to the storeroom where he figured he'd find the man he was looking for. Sure enough, when he opened the door and looked in, he found a fully naked Steve and a half-naked girl bent over some boxes of booze, having a good time. "Yo, Steve," said Dalton, and waited a second while the bouncer bent down to pull up his tighty-whities from around his ankles. "Your history." "But," Steve tried to protest, "I'm on my break." "Stay on it," Dalton told him, closing the door again as he went. The next tick on the list came at the end of the night. Dalton approached Pat the bartender as he was counting the take in the till. Everyone else was around the bar and the club cleaning up. "You've got quite a little enterprise going here," Dalton said calmly. Pat turned to him, a stupid look on his face. "What?" Dalton intentionally raised his voice so that everybody nearby, including Tillman, could hear, and told him what he'd witnessed over the course of just this one night. "You're going through a bottle every 30 minutes. You're skimming the till for 6 shots a bottle, on drafts 1 every 10. Tillman walked over at this, and Dalton turned his attention to him. "I figure he's costing you about $150 a night." At this point, Dalton was expecting a few denials at least, but Pat just met his glare with a cocky smirk and continued chewing his gum. "So?" he asked. "So, consider it severance pay," Dalton informed him. "Take the train." After a moment, Pat leaned on the bar. He ignored Dalton and addressed Tillman. "I didn't hear you say that," he said, but made it sound like a question. Dalton could see that Tillman was hesitating, the muscles in his jaw bunching, and wondered why. The agreement they had was that Tillman would back every move Dalton made, and he had up to now. He wondered what was different here. Tillman considered for only a few seconds more, and then declared, "Well, I'm saying it now." "You sure?" Pat asked seriously. Tillman's eyes went quickly to Dalton's and back to the bartender's, as if he was checking to see that the cooler had his back if this went the wrong way. "Get out," he ordered Pat finally. Pat laughed in Tillman's face, pulled out the dirty bar rag he carried in his belt and threw it at Tillman's chest, then stared Dalton down for a few short seconds. Finally, he left. Once he was gone, Tillman tried to lighten the mood and raise the spirits of the staff, who had just watched the whole thing go down. "Well," he said to them, putting on his best smile, "it was a good night. Nobody died." That got a few laughs and eased the tension, but Dalton looked at him and said from honest experience, "It'll get worse before it gets better." When Dalton headed out to the parking lot a little while later, his Buick was one of the only cars still there. As he approached it, he saw that the front windshield had a brick-sized hole in its center. The aerial was bent in half, and all 4 tires were flat. Whoever had done it, most likely the friends of the table dancing girl, had even left the knife in one of them for good measure. Dalton shook his head. New town, same story, he thought. He pulled off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. Then he popped the trunk and started taking out the 4 spare tires he'd had stored there. As Franklin said, "If you fail to plan, you are planning to fail."